All right, we'll get started. First off, thanks everyone for coming. My name is Marcus, and I am the Liaison Coordinator at the International Association of Political Science Students, or IAPSS Oceania, as well as your host for today's discussion. I'd like to welcome all of you in attendance today to our members-only event, and the first actually of our IAPSS Oceania events for 2021. Today, this one's entitled Reciprocal Access, Bilateral Security and Diplomacy in a Multipolar Indo-Pacific. So over the next hour, I'll be talking with our guest, Matt Moran, Executive Director of Defence West, on a selection of issues regarding the recent in-principle signing of the Reciprocal Access Agreement, signed between Australia and Japan just recently, and also the implications of Prime Minister Scott Morrison's in-person visit to Japan last November under COVID-19 travel restrictions. So before we get started, just in terms of a few housekeeping rules before we get started, there will be a brief Q&A at the end for about 15 minutes or so, so you can hold your questions until then and just post them in the chat, or I can unmute you and you can ask in person. So that's how we'll structure today. In this event as well, it will be recorded for our international audience who live in different time zones, so it will be online for their benefit. And I urge you all to like and subscribe and share and follow IAPSS Oceania on social media as well. So turning to our guest, Matt, I'll give just a short brief introduction. Matt Moran is the Executive Director of Defence West, a position which he has held since the 2019 federal election. Prior to that, and after the 2016 federal election, Matt joined the Minister for Defence Industries office as a policy advisor and was promoted to senior advisor in 2017, where he worked on defence projects throughout that time. And then also in 2018 of August, he was appointed to senior advisor for the Minister of Defence. Matt is also an Australian Army Afghanistan veteran and a Walkley Award winner with experience in media, having worked as a federal political reporter for Network 10 from 2011 to 2015. So Matt, if there's anything I've missed, I'll just hand over to you just briefly, and then I'll give some oversight of the access agreement that we'll be talking about.
Sure, thank you very much. No, it's a pretty good introduction. I've had a varied background as a journalist and then as an Army officer and then as a senior advisor to the Defence Minister. I was also a media advisor to Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull when he was Prime Minister of Australia. And so I think all of that helped me get the skills and the knowledge to then work into as an advisor, then senior advisor to both the Defence Industry Minister and Defence Minister, Christopher Pyne. And it was through that period from 2015 to sort of 2019 when I was working in federal politics as a staffer that we obviously were involved in some huge defence procurement contracts that had international significance. Japan was obviously in the mix for the future submarine program, so we can talk a little bit about that down the track. But I've had a varied background, and that helped me get the skills, I believe, to then become the Executive Director of Defence West. And Defence West is just, so people know, it's an office within the Department of Jobs, Tourism, Science and Innovation. It's a state government department, and we really try and help WA companies win more work, defence-related work.
All right, thanks for that. And with that, we'll turn to the topic of today's discussion, which is the Reciprocal Access Agreement between Australia and Japan. So for those who are unaware, this is a landmark defence treaty that will further deepen the country's strategic and security relationship. It will provide a clear framework for how Australian and Japanese defence forces will operate in each other's countries, and it builds upon previous agreements going back to the 2007 Joint Declaration on Security Operation, as well as the 2014 announcement of the Special Strategic Partnership. And this partnership is based on a shared commitment to democracy, human rights and the rule of law, as well as common approaches to international security. So this agreement really is about strengthening and deepening an understanding of the region and a way to react to it, as opposed to a formal sort of alliance. So it does represent a pivotal moment in the history of Japan-Australia ties. It took 6 years to negotiate, with a few sticking points, such as Japan's death penalty, as well, that had to be sort of negotiated around. So even with a focus on shared understanding and shared values, there were certain aspects that gave length to that 6-year interval. So it's the most significant collaboration between Japan and Australia since the 2011 earthquake and tsunami event. It is also the only other such agreement that Japan has struck with another country, apart from the US 60 years ago. So for a bit of the specifics, it will facilitate greater and more complex practical engagement between the Australian Defence Force as well as the Japanese Self-Defence Forces. So it will enhance interoperability and cooperation, supporting joint involvement in broader military exercises. So these can include joint military training exercises, natural disaster and humanitarian support, streamlining procedures to facilitate deployment and joint activities, including for entry and departure of visiting forces, as well as customs duties and taxes and criminal jurisdiction. So essentially, to sum up, this agreement will form a key plank of Australia and Japan's response to an increasingly challenging security environment in the region amid more uncertain strategic circumstances. So with that, I'll just hand back over to Matt for his initial thoughts on the agreement and its significance.
Well, I suppose that one of the key things that I think we need to understand is, and you touched on it, and that was that it is the most significant agreement that Japan has struck with another country, in 60 years. The last one was America. So I think that's a key point that we need to understand, that Japan and Australia are very, very close when you consider how close America is to Japan. And the last one, similar agreement, was 60 years ago. So I think that's the first thing. It highlights how significant this moment is. It also highlights the need for countries that are allies of America to be close to Japan. I just literally got out of a meeting with the US Defence Attaché, who's visiting Perth at the moment. And one of the questions that he asked was about, what is your relationship or interest in India like going forward? So they're looking at what are countries that they can have strategic relationships with that will help America's global presence. One of them would be India, and obviously another one is Japan. So for America, it's important that we have close relationships with Japan, but it's incredibly important that we have close relationships with Japan, especially when you consider the interests around the South China Sea and those sort of issues. Having that really close defence relationship with Japan is important for our Australian Defence Force. It's important for the Japanese Defence Force. It's also important for the United States. But I'm speaking from my perspective in Western Australia. I'm not a strategic analyst in Canberra working in Russell with Defence. They would have far more knowledge as to why they entered into this important agreement with Japan than I would, for example. So I'm not going to pretend to have all of their background, but I think it just highlights that the relationship between Japan and Australia is very close and is getting closer. The issues around the Indo-Pacific are only becoming more apparent and more concerning. If you think about, for example, what's happening with COVID around the world, the need to have safe ports away from COVID-infected areas is incredibly important. We see in the United States, there is a real issue around from what I'm hearing, maintenance of boats and sustainment, and even the construction of military vessels in America because of COVID. COVID is shutting down a lot of those facilities. One of the ways they can deal with that is have great relationships with, for example, Australian ports, where potentially more construction and maintenance of US ships could happen in Western Australia. There's no reason why it couldn't happen with Japanese vessels as well. Now, but there's just whether or not there's a need for that, who knows? But I think any strengthening of relationships between allies is an incredibly important development, considering the amount of instability that is around the world at the moment. COVID has created a lot of problems and instability in the world, but I mean, this is a much broader issue around the rise of China, and then how India will be involved and how Japan will be involved in the future. And Australia is a key integral player in that mix, I believe.
Well, you bring up a good and important point about Australia's sort of maritime capacity, which has been increasing in recent years, especially here in WA, where you're both located, with the building of new ships and some submarine contracts as well. Regardless of any controversy around sort of the acquisition and procurement and sort of development of these vessels, recently in the news there was a piece about the sort of Australian submarine maintenance would be sort of kept in the older British system rather than sort of upgrading it to a new system. Would a sort of stronger defense ties allow more countries in to that sort of supply chain to be able to contribute more where, as the industry sort of changed, be able to fill those aspects that maybe COVID is leaving a little bit or exacerbating the problems in sort of supplying some of the parts for programs like that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that COVID has really highlighted is the need for sovereign supply chains and the need to have good quality local manufacturing. So that's the first point. I think COVID has highlighted the need for sovereign supply chains. We have seen more investment in Australian industries and Australian companies. But what also that highlights is that the huge investment in naval infrastructure, huge investment in naval, capability, for want of a better word, submarines, frigates, or whatever, will open up opportunities for overseas companies to come into the Australian market. I'll use an example that's land-based. So Land 400 Phase 2 was won by a company called Rciprocal. That program is for combat reconnaissance vehicles. There was another company, BAE, was competing against Rciprocal. Rciprocal won, BAE lost. At the moment, Phase 3 of that is up for grabs, and that is anywhere from $15 billion upwards. That program, that's Land 400 Phase 3. Now, Hanwha, which is a South Korean company, is competing against Rciprocal for that contract. So the huge expansion that we are seeing in our military, in our submarine and in our naval capability opens up the opportunity for foreign companies to come in and be involved in our Australian Defence Force. Now, Hanwha is Korean, it's not Japanese, but the huge investment that the Australian government is putting into defence and our defence equipment opens up the opportunity for companies that are Japanese to come in and invest in Australia. In Western Australia, we are trying to attract more defence primes into Western Australia and open up for business. WA has been very heavily mining focused. We're trying to diversify our economy, and the investment the federal government has made into defence, gives us opportunities to try and attract overseas companies to Western Australia. And look, we'd love Japanese companies to invest in Australia, and equally we'd like to export our products to the Japanese Defence Force as well.
Is there a sense that these sorts of agreements, strategic agreements in particular, which have, in this case, the RAA has been built up over a long time in terms of the shared understanding? Do you think that shared understanding, support for democracy, rules-based order, are those necessary prerequisites for companies looking to engage with Australia and its sort of defence apparatus and infrastructure going forward?
So I think, any company is going to be interested in investing in a country they know that has a stable political environment, that has a similar military mindset. They're an ally. I think, there's going to be opportunities for companies to get involved more because of an agreement like this. I mean, the French signed a strategic partnering agreement with Australia when they signed up for the attack class submarine contract, which is worth, 50 billion in constant dollars, or nearly 90 billion if you talk about outturned, if you take into account inflation and currency exchange increases and things like that. So I think agreements like this do forge closer relationships. There's absolutely no doubt about that. It was a symbolic decision to have an agreement like this, but it's also quite significant. We talked about how the only one that's been done was 60 years ago, and that was with the United States. The fact that they've done it with Australia says that they believe there is an advantage to have a closer relationship with Australia. They're not going to do it just for the sake of it. There's many other countries that would like to have a very close relationship with Japan, I'm sure. So I think agreements like this do cause you to have closer relationships. The relationship with France is a lot closer now than it was 5 to 10 years ago, before we signed the strategic partnering agreement in relation to the attack class subs. So I think that you've got to look at, even if you take into account the agreement that was made with the United States military to position and place US Marines in Darwin, that has led to a close relationship between the Northern Territory, America, and Canberra, for example. So all these sorts of agreements, I like to think, are a precursor to a closer relationship and more opportunities.
So I guess would it be sort of fair to say that more bilateral agreements would be better suited for a region that's particularly volatile at the moment and has been historically, where you see sort of multilateral agreements like the regional comprehensive economic partnership sort of falling a bit over with India deciding not to sign. So are these sort of smaller two-way agreements, will they become sort of a stepping stone for bigger regional agreements, or do you think that they're just going to be sort of negotiated in isolation given particular circumstances?
Well, I think Australia's interest, America's interest, Japan's interest is in maintaining the rules-based global order, and agreements that help achieve that is what we all want. I'm not probably privy to knowing whether a bilateral is more helpful than a trilateral or a multilateral or things like that. I think any agreements that helps individual countries achieve their aims and make the world a safer place is a good thing, whether that be between one country, two countries, four countries. I'll leave that up to the foreign affairs experts, but quite clearly it's harder to sign an agreement with more people involved than less people. So they're obviously more complex. And then there's a give and take in negotiation as to what country has given up X in order to get Y out of another country.
And there, just on that, making the region sort of more safe, there are different sort of perspectives on, I guess, the perceived threat of China in terms of Australia and Japan. So Japan has sort of long since viewed China with suspicion and trepidation, and is a bit more, I guess, ready to accept China as a threat than Australia has been. Recently, China's actions in the South China Sea and its sort of trade war with Australia in recent times has sort of, I guess, changed the way that individual nations in the region look to interact with each other, not necessarily China. So an agreement like the RAA, in your view, is that sort of more about sort of disaster relief and non-conventional forms of security, such as deploying troops here or there for disaster relief, or for climate change purposes, perhaps in the South Pacific, where countries are sort of more inclined to view the threat of climate change rather than a nation state more readily? Or is it sort of a sort of one step towards a formal alliance like the US has with Japan, and that they have signed for 60 years, and that's been sort of this sort of backbone to security in the region?
Well, that's a big question. I think what this means, broader than that, I'm probably not the best person to ask about, what it will lead to. But I mean, my understanding is that they've reached an in-principle agreement in relation to this. The steps from here could take quite a while. So I mean, I'm curious to know what you think. I mean, do you think this is an in-principle agreement now? Do you think it will lead to broader and closer military ties other than just training, humanitarian and disaster relief?
Well, there is sort of, I guess, broader element of sort of what the practicalities of this agreement mean for the region, because, Australia has been participating in sort of maritime training exercises. Japan recently participated in exercise Talisman Sabre, which was its first ever deployment of Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force vessels to this exercise. So I guess given the fact that Japan has a pacifist constitution, and it has been sort of looking at ways it can contribute to security on an international stage more readily in the last few decades, with sort of participating in UN peacekeeping exercises in the region. It's sort of another agreement that kind of lets Japan, push itself into the region as a sovereign nation a little bit more firmly than it has. So in that context, I think these agreements can open up more leeway for countries to behave in ways they might otherwise not, even if it's not a formal sort of alliance. So there is, in this agreement, there is no obligation for either country to come to the other's aid in the event of an attack. So it is sort of also, on the flip side, sort of largely symbolic. And I think, based on that, the symbolism there, I think, is what's important. So Prime Minister Scott Morrison's visit to Japan to actually sign this in principle, I think, under COVID travel restrictions, sent a message that Australia was taking the special partnership with Japan very seriously. And you saw that with Maurice Payne, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, traveled to the Osman talks in the US, knowing that they would have to quarantine as well, and sort of those officials and the Prime Minister acknowledging that and then still doing it anyway, I think, really sent sort of a clear message, which wasn't necessarily geostrategic, but it was possibly, geo-diplomatic in a certain sense. So yeah, I think these agreements will always kind of have a strategic or security kind of sort of undercurrent to them. But that, of course, is also dependent on the perception of it by other countries. And, neither of us are experts on other countries' foreign policies. So it really is sort of probably more geared to that shared understanding, which countries outside of that, will not necessarily react to or be pulled into quite so easily. So, so I guess that's my take.
There's no doubt that it will support our. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that it will support our joint involvement in multilateral exercises, for example. But I think you make a very good point about the fact that the Prime Minister travelled during COVID restrictions to sign this is quite an important gesture. And Japan is a very formal country, and that formality and respect, I think, would have been very, very highly respected and gone down very well in Japan, that the Prime Minister did travel there, did sign that agreement under the COVID restrictions. I was in Japan at the start of last year, actually, and was there just as COVID was really taking off. I arrived back in very would have been very early March from Tokyo. So that was when COVID was kicking off. Everyone was wearing masks in Japan a lot before, obviously, Australia is. And in Perth right now, we're all wearing masks. And there's a real issue. There was a real concern in Japan, for example, that COVID was going to get out of control. It's obviously really bad in America and other countries, as in the UK. But the fact that the Prime Minister went over there and did sign it in person, especially diplomatically, and if you think about foreign relations between leaders, formality and respect is something that goes a long way. Diplomatic relationships can be broken very quickly when there's some kind of snub or some kind of non-attendance at an event, unless, of course, there's a legitimate reason. So I think that trip was pretty calculated and pretty smart.
There's that saying that the more diplomats you have, the less bullets you need. So it's interesting, and I'll attribute that to Professor Peter Dean, who we had last year speak on the sort of 2020 defence strategy update, and that was one of the things that he mentioned. And it is interesting to see how relevant it continues to be with sort of newer agreements and sort of defence budgets coming out, because defence in Australia has been really heightened while DFAT and our foreign sort of service have been experiencing cuts. COVID-19 will undoubtedly, the effects that we've not fully felt yet, and they'll be sort of resolved over the next few decades, perhaps. The targets of 2050 that were sort of circulating in 2020, look very different now than they did even a year ago. So, so with sort of COVID and sort of countries returning to sort of protectionism, becoming sort of more wary of their neighbours, given, I guess we can take the example of Myanmar to bring it back to Oceania, and just how, a military coup and ousting a democratic leader has led to the US, I think, placing sanctions on Myanmar, and Australia considering it, I think, in just this past week. So given sort of developments that kind of come out of COVID that can't be foreseen, and probably the spending and logistics problems that might arise from it, what are your thoughts on sort of how Australia should or can utilize its sort of national defence infrastructure to kind of keep its presence in Oceania and the region going through this sort of difficult time?
Well, good question. So I was just talking and meeting with the US Defence Attaché, who travelled from Canberra to Perth. One of the key things that was used quite effectively is the Defence Attaché network in overseas embassies, for example, and high commissions. So I think, that network's going to be really important trying to deal with COVID, because you're not going to have as many visitors from Australia, for example, going into countries in the Indo-Pacific area, because we can't travel. This year, I don't think there's going to be many, if any, international travel at all, unless there's exceptional circumstances. So we're going to have to use our overseas Defence Attaché network and our high commissioners and our ambassadors a lot more in order to get our messages across if you can't have visitors from Australia. So I think that's the first thing. We've got to use our current resources more effectively. But this is a question that DFAT and Defence really needs to answer. Me in a state government office could only provide my personal views on it. I really don't have much more that I can add other than the fact that personal connections and face-to-face meetings are really powerful. And COVID has taught us that whilst that is powerful, you can still have meaningful relationships and dialogue like we're doing right now online. So it's a balance, I suppose, of having those online meetings, but then having those face-to-face meetings with your attachés and your senior DFAT staff in those countries to make sure you keep those connections.
And is there sort of any scope, I guess, for sort of, we've seen COVID has kind of, impacted our aviation sector quite heavily, with a lot of sort of Qantas personnel, Jetstar, Virgin Airlines as well, those sorts of personnel who cannot work in the commercial sector have been sort of picked up by the defence sector. For example, in a recent media release from Defence Minister Linda Reynolds, the Defence Minister, the Minister for Defence Industry, Melissa Price, said that there was a sort of a program going on in the Hunter region over east, where aviation staff let go by Jetstar were actually hired by BASA, recently hired 25 former Jetstar employees who were made redundant. So there is sort of this interplay between the sort of the private sector and also the defence sector in terms of capacity building for defence and security and national strategy. So what are your thoughts on sort of maybe what Australia or WA in particular might need to do to kind of keep this capacity going as well in light of that?
Well, yeah, I mean, the aviation sector, and I know people who've been affected by the shutdown of the aviation sector and how they've had to try and find other work in different areas. But if you think about, whether they come into defence industry, for example, defence now views industry as a fundamental input to capability. So there's been a shift towards, I suppose, looking at defence industry more as a key element and a key input to the capability that defence needs. And so, for example, getting workers out of the aviation sector that have skills that can be plugged into the defence industry, which is going to help the defence sector, is something that obviously has been embraced by some companies. And, we would be supportive of that happening in Western Australia as well. The aviation sector is going to be affected by COVID for a while yet. Look what's happened at Qantas before COVID happened. They were doing very, very well, but now they've had to slash staff, cut back on costs, and increasingly look at how they can diversify into, things like Qantas wine and all of those sorts of things. So everyone's trying to be innovative in how they deal with COVID, whether they be aviation or not. Defence industry has been lucky in the sense that it has been affected by COVID, but nowhere near as much as other industries. Just recently in Western Australia, defence industry was classified as defence industry workers were classified as essential, which would mean that if we have another COVID lockdown like we did a week or two ago, those workers who are deemed essential can keep carrying on with what they do. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, that defence industry is considered a fundamental input to capability for defence, and defence industry workers are considered essential when a COVID lockdown happens. And so I think that that's something important to remember about the stability of a workforce, the stability of an industry. The defence industry is really resilient and has actually held up quite well against against COVID, which is actually obviously important because defence industry is critical to the defence of our nation.
And I think you're right. And without a sort of strong defence industry, Australia wouldn't have the position it has to be able to pursue its national interests in the way that it can, and in the way that it might have to in the region going forward. So because there's always an element of unknown, you can't plan for everything, but these agreements certainly do signal to Australia's allies and also the region, what the direction is, I guess, going forward. So an interesting thing that struck me about this particular agreement was that it solidifies, a long-standing relationship Australia has with Japan, but at the same time, it also gives Japan some leeway in what it can do. So in terms of, countries making their national defense networks be able to be agile to unforeseen threats, and I guess those sort of gray areas as well, sort of cybersecurity, other related aspects of security. These agreements kind of make certain things clear enough that capacity can keep building, and the Indo-Pacific can be made to kind of conform to the rules-based order a little bit more. So yeah, I do think that these agreements they're not intended to cover everything, and they'll always continue to develop. So we have sort of strategic updates which kind of in broad strokes really sort of pick quite large targets and allocate lots of money to places, but these sort of smaller agreements definitely do sort of fill in some of those gaps and some of the unknowns. So I guess we're nearing our question time. So if anybody would like to put anything in the chat, I will ask for you, or I can unmute you if you prefer. We can go from there. So I guess just to start with, I might just try and ask you a quick question about something we haven't really spoken on, which is do bilateral security agreements, with larger partners, sort of like Japan, do they sort of undermine a country's standing, perhaps in the eyes of smaller nations, particularly in the region? Or how would you think that such an agreement might be perceived by a country that doesn't have a lot to offer Australia in terms of mutual security?
Well, I think it depends on the relationship between that other country and Japan, for a start, whether they like them or don't like them. Also, Australia having close relationships with a country like Japan, I would have thought was a good thing. It shows that Australia is a significant player in world affairs, and therefore we're more relevant to other countries. So I don't necessarily think of it as a bad thing. Obviously, it depends on the relationship that that country has with Japan or any other country we sign an agreement with, which obviously, we would look at. And as I said, I'm not a foreign policy expert, so I'll leave that up to DFAT. But I would like to think that we would sign agreements that are in our interests, and obviously will have a mutual benefit to those countries.
And then I guess to follow up on that, do you think there'll be sort of more opportunities for, multilateral training exercises in terms of, I guess, the Quad sort of coming together, with India having expressed a desire to be let back into those sort of talks?
Well, I think America is very interested in having a closer relationship with India, no doubt about that. With the rise of China, India is very much on the US's radar. Absolutely, India is very much on our radar. I think it's a country with huge opportunities that we would like to be more involved in. So the signing of the RAA, I think, will help Australia and Japan in multilateral exercises, without a doubt.
Yeah. So I can't see any questions in the chat at the moment. So I guess we're pretty close to wrapping up. Do you have any final thoughts?
If it brings countries closer together, it'll provide more opportunities for, for obviously exercises together. The export of defence equipment to Japan is obviously something we would like to do. And I think it just provides more opportunities for Australia to have a closer connection with Japan, which will obviously be beneficial for both our Defence Force and local businesses.
Yep. I just have a question from Connor. Connor, if you want to post that in the chat, or I can unmute you. I'll just unmute. That might be simplest.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, great, lovely. Yeah, super interesting talk. It's great to get a deeper insight into the agreement. I just have a quick question about the Commonwealth procurement rules, and if you think with this sort of reciprocal agreement there could be some potential change in those, specifically regarding, I think there's a section in it which sort of mentions that in regards to procurement, that they won't discriminate against any entities. Any government suppliers must not discriminate against companies due to their size, degree of foreign affiliation or ownership, location or origin of their goods. If we're sort of pushing for more sovereign defense capability, do you think sort of rules such as that may need to be sort of adapted to suit this new goal?
It's a very interesting question. The Commonwealth procurement rules were recently re-looked at, revamped. I think there is a greater emphasis on sovereign capability. I know for a fact that what's known as AIC, or Australian Industry Content, or Australian Industry Capability, depending on what you want to call the C, there is much more emphasis from the Australian government on having an increased AIC percentage in defence contracts. How that relates with the Commonwealth procurement rules, I'll leave that up to the defence experts in Canberra to answer. But I do know that from a policy perspective, the federal government is very keen to have more content from Australian companies. So, how they, walk that tightrope between the Commonwealth procurement rules and increasing the AIC percentage, I'll leave it up to them to decide.
Well, a great question. Thanks for that, Connor. I guess we are reaching the top of the hour now, so if there aren't any more questions there, I guess we'll leave the conversation here. So I do want to thank our guest speaker, Matt Moran, for taking the time out of his day to speak today and for this great and enlightening conversation. Matt, your perspective has been really insightful and really shed some light, I think, onto some of the more nuanced aspects of this agreement. Thank you also to all of our attendees. I do hope that you've enjoyed this talk. Again, please keep an eye out on our social media, especially for the launch of this video. And if you have any questions, feel free to direct them to the team at any point. And finally, on behalf of IAPSS Oceania and the association as a whole, I'd like to once again thank Matt. We're very grateful for your involvement today, Matt, and hope that we might see you again in future events and initiatives. So with all that said, we'll wrap up there, and thanks everyone, and stay safe.
Thank you.